She used to think about the harp. Not in the way a child thinks about a toy, not with that loose, unanchored longing for something bright and far away. She thought about it the way a person thinks about breathing, as something that already lived inside her, waiting to be touched. She would sit at the instrument in the mornings before the rest of the house woke up, and the sound she drew from it was so clean, so pure, that it seemed impossible that the same hands that made that sound could also be the hands that reached for a cereal box, or turned the pages of a school textbook, or tugged the zipper on a backpack. The music made her feel separate from the ordinary world, and that was what she loved about it. That feeling of stepping sideways into something that nobody could follow her into. She was 14 years old. That matters. Not as a fact about vulnerability, not as a statistic, but as a kind of light, a very specific quality of light that only exists in the space between childhood and something else. She still believed that the people who were supposed to protect her would always protect her. That was not naivety. That was June 2002 in a house in Federal Heights, Salt Lake City, Utah. That was what it felt like to have parents who prayed and meant it, to have siblings who were loud and constant and real, to have a bedroom window that looked out over a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where the streets were so quiet at night that the only sound was the kind of silence that means safety. She was the second of 6 children. She was good in school. She had a best friend, a cousin named Olivia, who would come over and they would talk for hours about nothing that mattered very much and everything that mattered entirely. She was the kind of girl who smiled at people and meant it. She was close to her faith, not in a performed way, not in the way that looks like faith from the outside when it is actually something else, but in the real interior way, the way that gives you a private language for the world, a set of stories that help you locate yourself when things feel uncertain. She had never held a boy's hand. She did not know that that detail would become one of the most important things anyone would ever say about those 9 months, that she would one day speak those words in a courtroom and they would hang in the air like something burning. But on the morning before everything, on the ordinary day before the last ordinary day, she did not know any of that. She was 14. She was finishing middle school. She played the harp. Her bedroom window looked out over the quiet neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. She shared that bedroom with her younger sister. Her name was Mary Catherine, and she was 9 years old, and she was asleep. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. There are people who cross your path and leave no trace. You would not remember them the next day. Maybe not even an hour later. A man on a street corner, a stranger your mother stopped to speak to, a shadow at the edge of your peripheral vision on a busy morning. You absorb them the way you absorb noise, passingly, without filing them anywhere that matters. The brain has a system for this. It decides, in fractions of a second, what is worth keeping and what gets discarded. In November of 2001, 6 months before the night in question, a woman named Lois Smart encountered a man who was panhandling on the streets of downtown Salt Lake City. He was dressed in robes. He spoke with the cadence of a preacher, unhurried and assured, the kind of voice that implied it was accustomed to being listened to. Lois Smart was a religious woman, a kind woman, a woman who believed that you saw God in the people you helped. She gave him $5. And then, because she had work that needed doing at the house, she gave him something more. She offered him a small roofing job. He came. He worked for a day. He moved through the family's home in Federal Heights, and the family moved around him the way you move around a repairman, half noticing, mostly preoccupied with the ordinary machinery of daily life. The children were there. Elizabeth was there. And in a mind that had already turned, already tilted away from the world most people inhabit, a decision was made. Not loudly. Not with the drama that the word decision implies. It was more like a conclusion, and the conclusion was this: she was the one. He called himself Emmanuel. Or Emmanuel. Depending on the day, depending on the mood, depending on which biblical passage he had been meditating on. The full name he had given himself was Emmanuel David Isaiah, and he believed, with the complete, interior certainty that is available only to people for whom reality has become a private country, that he was a prophet. Not a metaphorical prophet. Not a man with spiritual gifts who interpreted his insights poetically. He believed, literally and structurally, that he had been chosen by God to fulfill a specific and urgent mission, and that this mission involved taking young women as plural wives and battling the Antichrist at some point in the near future. He had a whole theology. Detailed. Cross-referenced. Annotated in his mind with scripture. He planned to take 7 girls. Elizabeth would be the first. His real name was Brian David Mitchell. He was 48 years old when he worked on the Smart family's roof. He had been raised in a middle-class Mormon household in Salt Lake City, the third of 6 children. His father had been a social worker. His mother had been a teacher. He had been married before, to a woman who later described a marriage that unraveled into something unrecognizable. He had children he had left behind. He had a history that wound through decades and institutions and eventually deposited him on a street corner in downtown Salt Lake City in robes, calling himself a prophet, believing every word of it. His wife at the time was named Wanda Barzee. She had followed him into his world completely, submitting herself to his theology, to his dominance, to a logic that required her to believe things that ordinary life would have told her were not true. She had her own name now, Hephzibah. She and Mitchell panhandled together. They preached in the streets. They had been excommunicated from the LDS Church in June 2002 for their unorthodox beliefs, which tells you both that their beliefs had become extreme enough to warrant formal removal and that the removal had absolutely no effect on what came next. On the night of June 4th, moving into the early hours of June 5, 2002, Brian David Mitchell cut through a window screen. He had been watching the house. He knew the layout. He had walked through those rooms the previous year with paint on his hands and the family's coffee table in his peripheral vision. He knew which window to cut. He knew which room. He knew that the girls slept there together, the 14-year-old and the 9-year-old, and he came in through the darkness with a knife. Elizabeth Smart woke up to a blade at her throat. There is a moment when the mind refuses. It is not cowardice and it is not stupidity. It is the brain doing exactly what it is designed to do, which is to protect you from things that are too large to absorb all at once. When Elizabeth Smart woke up with a knife at her throat, the first thing her mind likely tried to do was tell her that she was dreaming. That the figure over her was not real. That the weight of the presence and the cold clarity of the blade were products of sleep, distortions of some nightmare that was already dissolving at the edges. She would find her way back to her own room, her own sheets, the soft sound of her sister breathing in the other bed. But Mary Catherine was in the other bed, and Mary Catherine was awake. The 9-year-old had woken at the sound of someone entering the room. She lay still, not from paralysis, but from a survival instinct that was extraordinary in a child that age. She understood, in some wordless and ancient part of her, that she should not move. She should not make a sound. She watched her older sister get taken. She heard the men tell Elizabeth that if she resisted, if she made a sound, he would come back and kill Mary Catherine. She lay in the dark and she watched them leave through the window and then she ran to her parents' room. Ed and Lois Smart called the police at 4 a.m. By then, Elizabeth was already moving. She walked 4 miles in her red pajamas. Think about that. Not as a dramatic detail, as a physical reality. 4 miles through the darkness, through the terrain of the Wasatch Range foothills on the eastern edge of Salt Lake City, in pajamas, with a knife at her back. Mitchell told her she was blessed that this was happening to her. He told her she should be thankful. She did not believe him. She refused to believe him. That refusal, quiet and internal, was the first act of resistance in what would become 9 months of interior warfare, a war that the outside world would not see, would not know about, would spend months searching for without finding. At the end of those 4 miles, at a campsite hidden in the trees, Wanda Barzee was waiting. Later, Elizabeth Smart would describe this moment with a precision that is its own kind of courage. The woman proceeded to wash her feet. Biblical. Deliberate. A ritual performed in total seriousness, as if the ceremony made it real, as if the washing sanctified what was coming. Then she was told to change out of her pajamas into a robe-like garment. She refused. Barzee told her that if she didn't comply, she would have Mitchell come in and rip the pajamas off her himself. She put on the robe. Then Mitchell performed what he called a wedding ceremony. And then he raped her. She was 14 years old. She had never held a boy's hand. Here is something that is very difficult to sit with. The camp was close. It was not hundreds of miles away, not in some distant state, not across a border or deep in a wilderness so remote that absence made physical sense. The camp was in the foothills above Salt Lake City. 3 miles, roughly, from the house where her family was going insane with grief and confusion and frantic, increasingly desperate activity. 3 miles, as the bird flies, between the tent where she was being held and the bedroom window through which she had disappeared. She could hear the search parties. Volunteers calling her name. Organized search teams moving through the terrain with dogs and flashlights, and that particular quality of human voice that means we are looking for you, we have not stopped. Elizabeth Smart was shackled to a tree with a 10-foot metal cable around her leg, and she could hear people calling her name, and she could not call back. Not because she had been made helpless, though the cable made escape nearly impossible, but because Mitchell had told her what he would do if she called out. He had told her what he would do to her. He had told her what he would do to her family. When you are 14 years old and you have watched the entire architecture of your safety dissolve in a single night, when you have learned in the most visceral possible way that the people who were supposed to protect you cannot protect you from this, when you have been shackled to a tree and taught through repetition and terror what the consequences of resistance are, the threat of death is not abstract. It is the most concrete thing in the world. It is the weight of the cable on your leg. It is the sound of him in the tent. It is the knowledge, empirical and undeniable, that he has already done things you could not have imagined a week ago, and the only logical conclusion is that the things he is threatening are equally possible. So she was silent. And the voices faded into the trees. Psychologists who later worked with Elizabeth and others like her have described this dynamic without using it to diminish what happened. The silence was not compliance. It was survival. Every single decision she made in those 9 months was oriented toward one thing: staying alive long enough to go home. That sounds simple. It was the most complex interior work a person can be asked to do, and she was doing it at 14, inside a camp hidden above a city that was looking for her, alone with people who had dismantled her sense of reality and were rebuilding it according to a theology she did not believe. Mitchell gave her a name. He called her Shirjashub, a biblical name, the name of the son of the prophet Isaiah. He also called her by another name she chose for herself. She chose Esther. She chose the name of a woman in the Hebrew scriptures who had been taken from her people, placed in a dangerous situation with powerful people she had not chosen, and who had survived through intelligence, through patience, through the careful navigation of a world that was not her own. Whether that choice was conscious or instinctive or something in between is not something anyone can say for certain. But she chose Esther. The camp was crude. A teepee-like structure, concealed in the trees. There was a hole covered by boards that Mitchell would sometimes put her in. She was not regularly fed. Days would pass with very little food. He forced her to drink alcohol, large amounts, until she vomited. He showed her pornography. He raped her 3 to 4 times a day. He told her, when she showed any hesitation, when her body or her expression communicated any of the resistance that was constantly alive inside her, the Lord wants you to experience this. He said the same thing to his wife. There is a particular cruelty in almost. Almost rescued. Almost recognized. Almost close enough that the word almost feels like a wound rather than a near miss. In the 9 months that Elizabeth Smart was missing, there were moments, documented, real, described in her own testimony, when the outside world was within reach. When the possibility of rescue was not a fantasy but a physical fact, a matter of inches and seconds and words that were never spoken. She was taken into Salt Lake City. This is important to understand. Mitchell and Barzee did not keep her entirely isolated on that mountain. They had practical needs, food, supplies, the maintenance of their nomadic existence, and they had a theology that actually required public presence. Mitchell was a street preacher. His identity was organized around the idea of being seen, being heard, performing his prophethood before an audience. So he took his wives into the city. Elizabeth wore a veil. Not a decorative veil. Not something that could be mistaken for cultural dress in an incidental way. A full covering over her face, a niqab, essentially, that obscured her features entirely. Beneath it, she wore the white robes Mitchell required. She walked behind him the way his theology required, at a distance, silent, a figure that would read to a passing glance as simply someone dressed in unfamiliar religious clothing. Utah in the summer of 2002 was a place with a lot of unfamiliar religious clothing. The state had a culture that included many strains of heterodox Mormonism, many sects and splinter groups and independent prophets. A man in white robes with 2 covered women was not, in that context, an impossible sight. And the face on the missing child posters was a school photograph of a 14-year-old girl in her ordinary life. Blonde hair, bright smile, the specific clarity of a child who has not yet learned to compose herself for cameras because she hasn't needed to. The face under the veil was malnourished, controlled, wearing the concentrated stillness of someone who has had to learn not to show anything on their face. But there was a moment in a library. A police detective was conducting interviews, part of the ongoing investigation, and he encountered the three of them, Mitchell, Barzee, and a girl in a veil who did not speak. He asked why the girl was wearing the veil. He asked why she was not speaking. Mitchell told him they were ministers of Christ. He explained that they were protecting their daughter for her eventual marriage. Barzee, seated at the table, reached under it and gripped Elizabeth's leg. The message was clear. And Elizabeth Smart was silent. She has been asked, many times, why she didn't speak. Why she didn't seize that moment, or any of the other moments when the public world was close enough to touch. The answer she has given is the truest thing you can say about captivity, about the kind of terror that rewires the circuits of possibility. Every decision I made was to survive. She knew what he had done. She knew what he had threatened. She was alone in the middle of a crowded room with no protection and no certainty that a single word would save her rather than get her killed. She stayed silent. The detective moved on. While all of this was happening, while she was shackled, while she was silent, while she was making the quiet and relentless calculations of survival, a city was coming apart. Ed Smart went on television the morning after the disappearance. He is a tall man, a composed man in ordinary life, and on that morning he was neither of those things. He stood in front of cameras and said, "If you can hear me, Elizabeth is the sweetest girl. She's an angel. Please let her go." The directness of it, the naked love in it, reached across the broadcast and touched something in people. This was June 2002. The nation was still living in a kind of raw, collective vulnerability that had been installed 9 months earlier. People were already attuned to the idea that the worst things could happen anywhere, suddenly, without warning. Up to 2,000 volunteers a day joined the search. They combed the mountainside. They called her name. They moved through the same terrain where she was hidden, and the dogs lost the scent. Mitchell had been careful about that, had forced her to walk through routes designed to break the trail, and the teams moved in the wrong directions and the right directions and came close and moved away. The investigation made mistakes. That is a complicated truth, but it is a true one. In the early days, police directed significant attention toward a handyman named Richard Ricci, a man with a criminal record who had also worked for the Smart family. The suspicion was not baseless. Ricci had a history that made him a logical suspect by standard investigative logic. But the logic was wrong. Ricci was arrested on an unrelated parole violation and held while investigators tried to build a case. He died of a brain hemorrhage in August 2002, still under suspicion, without ever being charged in Elizabeth's disappearance, because he had nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, Mary Catherine had something. The 9-year-old sister had seen the man's face. She had heard his voice. She had been the only witness, and in the immediate aftermath, the trauma of what she had seen had compressed her memory into something she could not yet access fully. She told investigators what she could. But the details were fragmentary, uncertain, not enough. Months passed. And then, in October 2002, Mary Catherine was doing something utterly ordinary. She was paging through a Guinness Book of World Records. She came to a page. Something on it, a voice in her head, the specific texture of a memory that had been waiting, unlocked the door. She told her parents, the man who took Elizabeth sounded like a man named Emmanuel. A handyman. Someone who had worked at the house. Not Richard Ricci. Someone else. The family's crisis consultant, Chris Thomas, helped keep the case in the national media. They hired a sketch artist. They distributed the resulting drawing through every channel available to them. Police were skeptical. They did not believe that Mary Catherine's memory was reliable, that a 9-year-old's recollection from a single traumatic night could produce a useful identification this many months later. The Smart family believed her. They released the sketch in February 2003, over police objections. A woman came forward almost immediately to say that the man in the sketch looked like her brother. Mitchell's stepson saw the sketch during a February 15 episode of America's Most Wanted and made the identification. The name Brian David Mitchell entered the investigation. By then, Elizabeth Smart was no longer in Utah. In September 2002, 3 months into the captivity, Mitchell announced they were leaving. He packed up the camp. He took his wives, that is the word his theology required, that is the framework within which he organized the horror he was perpetrating, and they took a bus to California. San Diego County, mostly. They moved between campsites, between homeless shelters, between the shifting geography of people without fixed addresses. Mitchell continued to preach. He continued to position himself as a prophet in the public spaces he occupied. Barzee continued to follow. Elizabeth wore her robes and her veil and she survived, and every day was a calculation. In San Diego, Mitchell attempted to kidnap another girl. Elizabeth Smart has spoken about this. She has described the guilt and the terror of it. At some point during the captivity, probably out of exhaustion and longing, she had mentioned her best friend, her cousin Olivia. She had talked about her out of the simple animal need to speak the names of people she loved, to keep them alive in the air around her, to not lose the world she had come from. And Mitchell had filed it away. He had planned to take Olivia on July 24th, a state holiday in Utah when he calculated people would be distracted. The attempt failed. He had tried to climb through the wrong window, and trinkets on the sill fell and made noise, and her uncle woke up and ran into the room. Elizabeth has described the guilt of having inadvertently directed him toward her cousin as one of the worst things she carried during those months. She also described something more complicated, that there had been a small, terrible, human part of her that had wanted him to succeed. Not because she wanted her cousin to suffer, but because she was so alone, and she thought that maybe together they could have escaped. And then the guilt of feeling that, layered on top of everything else, as one more thing she had to carry. That is the interior life that nobody on the outside could see. Not the searchers calling her name. Not the volunteers who wept when they went home without finding her. Not her father on television saying she was an angel and pleading with the darkness to return her. They were all looking for a girl in a school photograph. They did not know that the girl in the school photograph had been inside a terrible kind of school for months, learning things about survival and fear and the private war that happens inside a person who has decided to stay alive. She had suicidal thoughts. She has spoken about this, too. After the first rape, she has said, she felt she was no longer human. She felt she was nothing. Her religious upbringing had included, as many abstinence-based faith traditions do, a metaphor about sexual purity that described a girl who had been sexually active as a piece of chewed-up gum, used and therefore discarded. She thought about that metaphor in the camp. She thought, if my family knew what had happened to me, would they still want me back? She thought, maybe it would be better if nobody ever found me. This thought did not win. It arrived, and she noticed it, and something in her refused it. She held on to the thing Mitchell could not see and could not take, which was her own interior certainty about who she was. It was fragile. It was threatened every day. But it was there. She has said she held on to the knowledge that she had something worth surviving for. She thought about her family. She thought about going home. She held on. Let's stay inside this for a moment, because the temptation when listening to a story like this is to move through the horror quickly, to reach the rescue, to reach the resolution, to exhale. But the 9 months were not a blur. They were 9 months of specific days and specific nights and specific moments that each had to be survived one at a time. She was 14 when this began. She turned 15 in November 2002, in captivity. There was no party. Her family threw a party anyway, back in Salt Lake City, even though she wasn't there, because they needed to mark the day and because marking it was a way of insisting on her continued existence. Later, after her return, they threw her another party, to make up for the one she'd missed. She sent a poster board to that party that read, "I am the luckiest girl in the world." But in November 2002, in the camp or in California or wherever they were at the moment her birthday came and went, that is a fact that does not need decoration. A child, alone, crossing from 14 to 15 in the possession of people who raped her daily. The theology was constant. Mitchell preached. He instructed. He told her that she had been chosen, that what was happening to her was part of a divine plan, that she should be grateful. He was, as she later testified in court with the composure that silenced the room, a man who used religion as a tool to get sex and food and drugs and alcohol. He was a hypocrite in the technical, observable sense of the word, a man who told her that God commanded him while simultaneously bragging to her about how good he was at manipulating people. That bragging was inadvertently clarifying. It showed her the seams in the performance. She did not believe him. This is important. She never believed him. She has been clear about this. The theology did not take root. She sat inside his ceremonies and his rituals and his prayers, and she kept her own self separate, at a distance, like a person watching a fire from behind glass. She was present in body and absent in conviction, and that distance, that quiet, unwavering refusal to surrender the interior, was the thing that saved her. Barzee was a presence in this. Complicated, dangerous, and in some ways harder to understand than Mitchell because her role involved active choice in a different register. She was not the architect of the theology. She was the one who had submitted to it, who had followed her husband into something that had required her to become, at best, complicit and at worst, a perpetrator. She was jealous of Elizabeth. Mitchell's rapes were a source of conflict between them, Barzee's anger directed at both Mitchell and at the girl she had helped imprison. Elizabeth navigated this triangle, the jealousy and the violence and the theology, every day. There were moments she was taken through streets where her face was on posters. Think about that. Walk through a city. Look at a missing child flyer on a telephone pole. The girl looking out from it is you. The people passing by are looking at it and not at you. You are right there. You are wearing a veil and walking behind a man who has told you what happens if you speak. What do you do with that? She did what she did with every unbearable thing in those months. She filed it. She contained it. She kept moving. She stayed alive. In early 2003, Mitchell announced a plan. They would move to a distant city. New York, perhaps. Or Boston. Somewhere far, somewhere new, somewhere that would put distance between him and whatever investigation was closing in, though he may not have known how close it was. He told his wives they were leaving. Elizabeth Smart did something that requires its own kind of acknowledgement. She persuaded him to go back to Salt Lake City. She had been in captivity for approximately 8 months at this point. She had survived things that should, by any ordinary measure, have destroyed a person's capacity for strategic thinking. She had been starved and shackled and violated and threatened. And she looked at a man who believed he was a prophet, and she found the seam in the theology, and she told him that she believed God wanted them to return to Salt Lake City. She made herself believable. She calibrated the tone, the content, the performance of belief, to exactly what Mitchell needed to hear. She knew him by then, not in the way you know someone you chose to know, but in the way you know your captor after 8 months, with the terrible intimacy of proximity and survival. She knew what he responded to. She knew how to phrase a revelation so that it landed in the right place in his theology. Mitchell agreed. They hitchhiked back to Utah. She had, through the only form of agency available to her, steered them back toward home. There is a moment in every complex, extended horror story when the turning point arrives. Not with trumpets. Not with dramatic music. With something as ordinary as a Wednesday afternoon in a suburb of Salt Lake City. March 12, 2003. Sandy, Utah. 18 miles from the house where the bedroom window had been cut open 9 months earlier. 2 witnesses, a couple who had seen the America's Most Wanted episode, who had seen the sketch, who recognized the figure of Brian David Mitchell from the broadcast, called the police. They had spotted a man they recognized walking with 2 figures in white robes and veils. Police were dispatched. Officers approached the group on a public street. Mitchell identified himself. He said the women were his wives. He said the young one was named Augustine Marshall and that she was 18 years old. One of the officers moved closer to the veiled figure and asked her to remove the veil. She did. And what was underneath was not Augustine Marshall, 18 years old. It was Elizabeth and Smart, 15 years old, who had been missing for 279 days. The officer recognized her. She was malnourished. She was dressed in someone else's clothing, someone else's theology, someone else's name. But she was alive. In the car on the way to the police station, something happened that has been analyzed and discussed and revisited many times. She began to cry, and she asked what would happen to Mitchell and Barzee. Are they going to be okay? She has been clear, later, that she did not have Stockholm Syndrome. She has explained this herself. The mechanisms of captivity and the way fear operates on the human brain over long periods of time do not fit neatly into any single clinical label. She was not in love with her captors. She did not identify with them. She had, for 9 months, had to read and respond to their emotional states in order to survive, and the residue of that practice was still running when the police put her in the car. At the police station, she was reunited with her father. Ed Smart, who had spent 9 months on television and in press conferences and in anguish, who had believed, as parents have to believe, that she would come home, who had kept going through the months when the investigation stalled and the leads went cold and the handyman they had suspected died in custody and the case seemed to have no floor, Ed Smart put his arms around his daughter. She has said it was the first time in 9 months that she felt safe. She went home. She watched a film. She read emails from well-wishers, hundreds of them, thousands of them, from people across the country who had put her face on their refrigerators and their bulletin boards and their prayers. She played her harp. She met the family's 2 new dogs. She slept in the same bed that Mitchell had taken her from. The next day, there was a party. A birthday party, belated by 4 months, to give back the birthday she had lost in captivity. She did not attend in the way you attend parties when you are well and whole and ready to be present. But she sent a poster board. I am the luckiest girl in the world. She had her nails painted. She opened birthday presents. She had her hair cut by a family friend. These details matter because they are so ordinary. Because the first thing she reached for, when she was returned to her life, was exactly this, the ordinary. The texture of normal days. The small rituals that mean you belong to yourself, that your time is your own, that nobody is going to come in through the window tonight. But the ordinary also had a weight it had not had before. There are things you learn in 9 months in captivity that do not leave when you leave. The body remembers. The mechanism of constant vigilance, the internal radar that was always scanning for danger, always calculating the temperature of the room, always reading the faces of people around her for signals of threat, that mechanism does not simply power down when the threat is removed. It was installed at 14 and it would take years to dismantle, carefully, in the company of people who could be trusted, in the protected space of therapy and time and faith and the particular stubbornness that she had always had, that had carried her through the camp. She did not speak about it publicly for a long time. The full story did not emerge in public until 2009, when she testified in court, 2,659 days and 7 hours after the night Mitchell had taken her. She stood up in a Salt Lake City courtroom, smiling, composed, smartly dressed, and she described 9 months of rape and terror in detail that lasted an hour and 40 minutes, and she maintained her composure for all of it. She testified in order to ensure that Brian David Mitchell would never do it again. She was right that he would have. He had already tried. He had a plan for 7 girls. He had identified her cousin. His theology required it. Whatever the forensic psychologists later said about his mental state, and they said quite a lot, over quite many years of competency hearings, before he was finally deemed fit for trial in 2010, the functional reality was that he was a man who had organized his entire worldview around the justification of doing what he did, and he would not have stopped. She knew that. She testified because she knew that. She stood before Congress in March 2006 to advocate for legislation protecting children from sexual predators. She was 18 years old. She was 3 years out of captivity and already doing the work of turning what had happened to her into something that might prevent it from happening to someone else. Later, at a speech that was widely circulated and widely heard, she said something that cut through all of the clinical language and the legal language and the analytical language that had surrounded her case since the beginning. She talked about a message she had received as part of her religious education before the kidnapping, the abstinence metaphor, the chewed-up gum, the idea that a girl who had lost her purity was used and therefore worthless. She said, I thought, oh my gosh, I am that chewed-up piece of gum. Nobody rechews a piece of gum. You throw it away. And that is how easy it is to feel like you no longer have worth. She said this in order to dismantle it. In order to put her arms around it and say, this is a lie that makes it harder for survivors to come home, and it has to stop. She was not angry in the way anger performs itself. She was precise. She was purposeful. She had identified a specific mechanism of harm and she was dismantling it in public because she had been close enough to it to know exactly where it lived. She has described suicidal thoughts after the first rape. She felt she was no longer human. She thought her family might not want her back. And she chose to live anyway. That choice was not easy. It was not inevitable. It was made under conditions that would have defeated most people, in the dark, alone, tethered to a tree, listening to the people calling her name fade into the trees. It was made through 8 months of waking up and deciding, again, to stay. And when she came home and the weight of what had happened began to settle into the rest of her life, she made the choice again. Not to be destroyed by it. Not to be defined by it in the way that destroys people, not to hand it the architecture of who she was. She had kept her interior self separate in the camp, behind the glass, watching. She kept that habit after. She did not let the worst thing become the only thing. Brian David Mitchell was convicted of interstate kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor with intent to engage in sexual activity on December 10, 2010. The verdict was read in a courtroom in Salt Lake City. He sang religious hymns during the reading of the verdict. He held his hands in front of his chest in prayer. He was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole in May 2011. He is 72 years old as of 2026. He is in federal custody at the Federal Correctional Institution in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. He will die there. Wanda Barzee pleaded guilty in 2009 to kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor. She received a 15-year sentence, with credit for 7 years already served. She stood in court and said, "I am so sorry, Elizabeth, for all the pain and suffering I caused you and your family." Elizabeth Smart, at the time, was on a Mormon mission in Paris. She was not in the room to hear it. Barzee was released in September 2018. Elizabeth Smart said she was surprised and disappointed. She said it was incomprehensible that someone who had refused to cooperate with mental health evaluations, who had not attended her own parole hearing, could be released. Her statement was precise and controlled and contained exactly the amount of grief that a sentence like that earns, which is a very specific, very cold kind of grief. In May 2025, Barzee was arrested in Salt Lake City for visiting 2 public parks, which she was prohibited from doing as a registered sex offender. She was 79 years old. Elizabeth Smart went on her Mormon mission to Paris in November 2009, 3 weeks after testifying in court against her captor. She returned briefly in November 2010 to testify at Mitchell's trial. Then she went back to Paris and resumed the mission. In Paris, she met a man named Matthew Gilmore. He was Scottish. He was also doing missionary work. They were married in Hawaii in 2012. They have 3 children. Chloe, James, Olivia. She named one of her children Olivia. She founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation in 2011. It works on prevention, recovery, and advocacy for victims of sexual violence and child abduction. She has testified before Congress. She has spoken at universities and conferences and courtrooms and on television and in memoirs. She wrote my story in 2013. She produced the Lifetime film I Am Elizabeth Smart in 2017. She appeared on Netflix's Kidnapped, Elizabeth Smart in January 2026. She has been asked, many times, how she recovered. She gives an answer that is honest and that resists the simplification the question wants. She says that time helps. She says that her faith helped. She says that choosing not to dwell in the past was a choice she made, consciously, because dwelling was not going to change what had happened and was only going to take more from her. She says, when you don't have a choice and you just have to keep going, you keep going. She says she is happy. Looking at the evidence of her life since March 12, 2003, the marriage, the children, the foundation, the testimony, the continued, relentless showing up for other people who are living through things she has some understanding of, the evidence supports the statement. She says she hopes other survivors who watch her story realize they are not alone. She says she hopes people gain compassion for families going through this. She says, I also hope it brings comfort that there are happy endings, and that even after terrible things happen, you can still have a wonderful life. There is a detail that keeps pulling at the edges of this story, one that deserves its own space. Mary Catherine Smart was 9 years old when she lay in the bed and pretended to be asleep and watched her sister disappear through a window. She was 9 years old. She carried that. She carried it in the way children carry enormous things, which is quietly, without the vocabulary to name it, in a body that is still learning what bodies do with overwhelming information. She watched investigators proceed for months in the wrong direction. She told them what she knew, and they did not believe her, and she was 9 years old, and she kept telling them. In October 2002, 4 months after the kidnapping, sitting on a couch, paging through a book, a completely ordinary book about records, world records, the kind of book a child looks at because it is full of strange and wonderful things, something in her memory cracked open. The voice. It was the voice of the man who had come to fix the roof. She had been there. She had heard him. Children absorb things that adults have learned to filter out, and the voice had gone in and stayed, archived in some deep place where traumatic memory lives outside of ordinary recall, waiting for the right trigger. A page in a book. A photograph of a muscular woman. Something that knocked the right door. She told her parents. She was right. She had been right all along. Mary Catherine Smart is in her 30s now. She has largely stayed out of the public eye, which is entirely her right. She has given a small number of interviews over the years. She has described the experience of being 9 years old and watching and waiting and not being believed. She has, in the way that people who carry extraordinary things sometimes do, become a quiet fact in the story, the person who saw, the person who remembered, the person who made the identification that led to the rescue. Elizabeth Smart is alive because her 9-year-old sister pretended to be asleep when every instinct in her body must have been screaming to do otherwise, and then went to her parents the moment Mitchell and Elizabeth left the room, and then 4 months later made a connection between a page in a book and a voice she had heard for 3 seconds in the dark. The question that gets asked, over and over, in cases like this, is why? Why didn't she run? Why didn't she call out? Why, when she was in the library with the detective, when she was in the city streets, when she was among people, why didn't she do the thing that seems, from the outside, so obvious? Elizabeth Smart has answered this question with patience that she should not have had to develop, because the question itself is misshapen. It locates the problem in her choices rather than in his. It asks, implicitly, what she could have done differently, as though the responsibility for her captivity was somehow evenly distributed between the person who held the knife and the 14-year-old girl who woke up to find it at her throat. The architecture of coercive control, the academic term for what Mitchell built around her, is designed specifically to make escape feel impossible. It is not a lock. Locks can be picked, doors can be opened. It is something more subtle and more total. It is the complete redefinition of what is possible, the installation of a worldview in which the consequences of resistance are so vivid and so certain that the calculation always returns to the same answer: stay silent, stay alive. She had seen what he was capable of. She had been shown what he would do. She had been told what he would do to her family. She was alone in a country whose terrain she did not know, in robes that were not her clothes, with a name that was not her name, tethered to his world by threats that were not theoretical because nothing about what had been done to her was theoretical. She was not passive. This is the word that always feels wrong when it gets applied to people in her situation. Passive implies lack of agency, absence of will. But she had been making active choices every single day. She chose the name Esther. She chose to hold her own identity behind a wall where he couldn't reach it. She chose to persuade him to return to Salt Lake City. She chose, when every reasonable analysis of her situation would have supported surrender, not to surrender. Those choices were made inside a very small radius. The walls of that radius were built by someone else. But the choices were hers, and they were real, and they are the reason she came home. There were 2,000 volunteers a day. They came in the weeks after the disappearance, when the case was saturating national news, when Elizabeth's school photograph was on every channel and every front page. They came from the neighborhood and from other neighborhoods and from other states. They wore the orange volunteer shirts and they moved in organized grids through the terrain and they called her name in the hot Utah summer, the sound carrying up into the foothills where she was hidden. Some of those searchers passed within a few hundred yards of where she was. She heard them. She has described this. Not in detail she dwells on, she does not dwell, she has made a practice of not dwelling, but she has confirmed it. The sound of her own name, called by strangers who cared enough to spend their day in the mountains looking for her. And she could not answer. Imagine carrying that. The sound of your name reaching you from a world that still knew you, still wanted you, still had a place set for you. And the cable around your leg. And the knowledge of what would happen. She was 14. She held that too. Here is what she said about coming home, about the day she was found, about the moment police approached them on the street in Sandy on a Wednesday afternoon in March. She said the rescue she had fantasized about during the 9 months was always dramatic. A cavalry arriving. A sudden, unmistakable intervention that would remove all ambiguity. The reality was different. It was ordinary streets, ordinary officers, an ordinary Wednesday, and then a moment of recognition that was quiet and certain and that moved through everything else like water. She was taken to the police station. She was put in her father's arms. She had her nails painted the next day. She played her harp. And here is what she has said about why she told the story, why she wrote the book, why she testified, why she stands in front of cameras and talks about the 9 months and about the shame and about the chewing gum metaphor and about suicidal thoughts after the first rape and about all of the things that happened at 14 in a camp in the mountains above a city that was calling her name. She says it is for the girl who is still there. Not her, not anymore. She has moved. She has built the life. She has the husband and the children and the foundation and the time. But the girl who is still there, still in the camp, still listening to her own name fade into the trees, still making the calculation of whether to stay silent, still holding her identity behind a wall where he cannot reach it, still deciding, every day, to stay alive, that girl exists in other places, in other situations, right now. Elizabeth Smart has said, I want survivors to know they are not alone. Not as a slogan. Not as the kind of thing you say because it is expected. But as someone who has been at the absolute bottom of what it is possible for a human being to endure and has come back from it and built a life that she loves, saying, you are not alone, and it is possible to come back, and the person you are is not what was done to you. She named her daughter Olivia. She played the harp. She goes on. And somewhere, in the last image of what this story holds, there is a girl who is 14 years old, on a morning before everything, sitting at an instrument whose sound is so clean that it seems impossible. The light comes through the window. The house is quiet. Her sister is asleep in the other bed. She draws the first note out of the strings, and the sound rises and hangs in the air, and she is exactly where she is supposed to be, and the world is exactly as safe as it is supposed to be, and the morning is ordinary, and her hands